Hi, welcome back to Gen Z Bible class. We're going to be getting into something that's a little different today because of the part of the story of Joseph that we're going to be looking at. This is in Genesis chapter 47, the last part of that. And I think earlier we asked the question, how did, when all these people come to Joseph and they need food, how does he handle all of the administration of this with all these people coming from not just Egypt, from other surrounding countries, because this famine had gone far away from Egypt as well. And we're going to get the answer to that question in this portion of scripture. And it's interesting, I don't how in the Bible certain things are mentioned and certain things are not things that you might wish to know. And this is just curious that this whole process that Joseph comes up with to administrate, the handling of all this food. And if you'll remember, there were 7 years of prosperity. So for 7 years, they were storing up all of this grain and all of this food and, putting it in storage bins. And then for the 7 years of famine, when they couldn't grow anything, they had something to eat. But people had to pay a price for it. And that's the part we're going to learn in this portion of Scripture. Now, I'm not going to read it all, but I want to just kind of go through eventually what happens year by year, because that's pretty much what's included in this story, this part of the story. And it starts in verse 13 of Genesis. And it just simply says, the first year, the people came because they couldn't grow food themselves, and I'm not real sure if this would have been the second year of the famine itself. Maybe that first year of the famine, they had enough food stored up of their own so that they could survive. You sort of saw that with Jacob and his family. So maybe then the second year, people have to come and start buying food. And that's exactly what Jacob had to do, if you'll remember. He sends his sons with silver to go buy some food. And then this portion tells us that eventually most people ran out of money. And that first year they would buy grain with their money, but the second year the famine is still going, or it might have been the third year of the famine, I'm not sure. They didn't have any more money, so how could they purchase grain? Well, the Bible tells us that they brought their livestock, which, that's kind of getting close to home, because their livestock was maybe the equivalent to, like today, we talk about the money we have in the bank, but we also talk about things like our car or our house. These are things that are a big part of how we view our wealth. For them, it wouldn't have been so much houses or cars, obviously, but their livestock. So now they have to, because your livestock are kind of like your security. These animals are handy. Your chickens give you eggs, and your cows give you milk and, meat. And it's a big part of staying alive back then. So now, the second year, Pharaoh is taking all of their livestock. And this is getting pretty serious now. And I don't know if the people were told that this is going to go on for 7 years. I'm guessing probably that they did. But now they're getting a little more desperate. Now, what happens on the third year? Well, now the people come, they have no more money, they have no more livestock to give to Pharaoh. So what do? They offer to indenture themselves as servants and give Pharaoh the land that they owned. Now this is getting very, very serious. And we get a description of this. This is kind of where we end up at in this third year, in Genesis 47, verse 20, where it says that Joseph bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh. The Egyptians, one and all, sold their fields because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's, and Joseph reduced the people to servitude from one end of Egypt to the other. So that draws a pretty good picture of where things were by the either third or fourth year of this famine. The people have literally become slaves. And that's going to be an important factor in the future. We'll talk a little bit about that. But what happens next? Well, Joseph, and this is where maybe Pharaoh becomes a little bit more benevolent. So far it's basically like he's taken everything he can from his people. And so I'm not sure where that puts him as a leader of his country. Definitely not a benevolent leader. He's basically taken everything he can and grabbing all the power and money and wealth, that he can, based on these circumstances, taking advantage of the people and the situation. But he comes up with a plan, because the interesting thing about this is, if you take all the people's stuff and all their money and just let them sort of wither on the vine, you're going to end up as a king with no kingdom. And I think Pharaoh knew this, and so he devises another plan, the next step in all of this, in order to get people through these next number of years. And here we read about that in verse 23. Joseph said to the people, "Now that I have bought you and your land for Pharaoh, here is the seed for you so you can plant ground. But when the crop comes in, give a fifth of it to Pharaoh. The other 4/5 you may keep as seed for the fields and as food for yourselves and your household and your children." So here, Pharaoh is exercising a certain amount of common sense. If you just let all the people die, your kingdom isn't going to be worth a whole lot. It even talks about, the children. The children are your kingdom. These are going to be the next generation that will become your kingdom. And a king needs people in his kingdom. And I think this whole step here, where, okay, you can have your land. Actually, I don't think they actually owned their land from this point on, but they were allowed to live on it as like indentured servants. And they had to give 1/5 of everything they made to Pharaoh. So now Pharaoh is sitting in, like we say, sitting pretty. I mean, he's in a pretty good situation. He's never had this much wealth. And I guess, to be fair, if you're Pharaoh, you have a lot of other responsibilities. Number one is to protect the people. So you actually, with that money, you're not just putting it in your pocket, but you have to administer things like the army and public works. And there's a lot of things that government does that's good. But I think in this case, things were getting a little out of balance. This whole taxation thing was getting a little bit out of hand. But this is where we find, this is how this whole time in history, this whole famine ends up. And it's really quite a change for the Egyptians and for the Pharaoh. So now verse 27 talks about the Israelites and how they were doing in all this. Now the Israelites settled in Egypt in the land of Goshen, and they acquired property there and were fruitful and increased greatly in number. So this kind of stands in contrast to what you might think. Even remember how Abraham, when he went to Egypt and there was this famine, and he ended up being blessed. God blessed him, and he comes back with more stuff than he had when he went in. So we're starting to see the same pattern here with Jacob's family, these chosen people of God, that God starts to bless them. And it simply concludes, the chapter concludes by telling us that they were becoming very prosperous. And that's, I guess, kind of a paradox, because how do you become prosperous in the middle of a famine? Well, God can work things out like that. But how do we want to conclude this? Remember, what we're trying to do is come to an understanding of what the Christian worldview is on all kinds of different subjects. And the Bible covers all kinds of different subjects, including, I guess we're getting into the area of political science here, when we think about world rulers and governments and leaders and things like that. And what does the Bible tell us about that? Well, I think the overall picture in the Bible when it comes to government is maybe a government is only as good as the people who govern. Well, Paul, the Apostle Paul, in his letters to the churches, tells people that they should respect the government. And I think this is probably a big part of the Christian worldview of government, that we understand that God has actually ordained earthly governments. Because, I mean, you need them. What would we do without them? And I think that's why Paul was telling Christians to be law-abiding citizens. And that was interesting, because when you think about when Paul was writing, Christians were being persecuted by the government. This same government that Paul is telling them to, obey the laws. They were being killed. They were being put in prison simply for being Christians. But at the same time, Paul tells them he sees the need for government, even though this particular government under Caesar, I think Caesar and Pharaoh had a lot in common, because they were all power hungry, and they just wanted more and more power for themselves, and they weren't exactly benevolent leaders for their people. And yet Paul tells Christians to respect the government and to be good citizens. We get some other pictures in the Bible that pertain to this idea of government. And we haven't got to the book of Revelation yet, but in the book of Revelation, it describes probably one of the worst forms of government that we will ever see on this earth. And that's when the Antichrist shows up. And he has a lot in common with guys like Caesar and like Pharaoh, in the sense that he wants to own everything. He wants to be in charge of everything. He wants to have complete control over people, and that's why I don't know if you've ever gotten into the book of Revelation and know much about these types of things, but the Bible tells us that there's going to come a time when he's going to put a mark on people's heads. And, people for years wondered, how in the world could that ever be? Now we know how it could be. They just plant a little chip in you, and it's going to get so bad that you will not be able to buy anything or sell anything unless you have this mark of the beast. And the reason I'm talking about that is because I think he represents the very worst form of government. And we see that throughout history. We've seen dictators that have been very cruel and very power hungry and have no concern about the people at all. And basically this is where you get into this whole area and argument about socialism or communism versus a democratic form of government where the people have the power. And unfortunately, we have some good examples, I don't know, maybe I should say bad examples, of how this plays out, especially in New York City right now. I don't know if you know what's going on in New York City, but their new mayor is trying to suggest that it wouldn't be improper for the government to step in and take over the housing and own the housing and decide who lives where. And it's really the same principle. It's just another picture of the bad government of somebody like the Antichrist. But anytime you look at a dictator, we have people in North Korea, we have people in China that are ruling over the people and want to have complete control. In China, they've got cameras everywhere, and they can tell exactly what you're doing every minute of the day. And if you don't cooperate with the government, and it's even worse in places like North Korea, where it's this same type of servitude, and people don't dare cross the government. Of course, this is not a good example of government, and this is not the kind of government that the Bible encourages or recognizes as being good. So this kind of a general view, biblical worldview in terms of government. Government is important, but basically it's only as good as the people who are governing. And now think a little bit more also about exactly what's going on here in Egypt. Go, back to that situation there. This is, from a historical standpoint, a huge change in the government of Egypt, because up until this time, before this time, Pharaoh never had that much power. And we're going to see that this is something that comes into play 400 years later, when the Israelites find themselves not in such good favor with the Pharaoh like they are now at this point in history, and they're going to become slaves to Pharaoh. And the interesting thing about that is that that probably wouldn't have been as possible if all of this hadn't happened, if Pharaoh hadn't gained essentially, and by Pharaoh I mean, of course, 400 years later, it's not the same person, but it's the same system. And Pharaoh was one of these people that thought he was pretty close to God and wanted people to literally worship him, very similar to the Caesars of the time of Rome. But we're going to see that it's part of, I guess you could say, God's plan and God's sovereign plan as he rules over history, and he uses even these bad leaders to accomplish his purpose. And it's going to come to the point in 400 years later, that these things that were set into play here are still part of the storyline even 400 years later. And I think this just reminds us that God is sovereign. And the interesting thing about Israel, as we said, that last verse said that Israel during this time was actually prospering. And I think we can see how maybe this was God's plan to increase the number of Israelites. I don't know if they could have done the same thing in Canaan, but Egypt was maybe a much bigger place, and it gave them the opportunity to become, instead of these 70 people that enter the land, like we read about last time, by the time it's 400 years later, there are literally millions of them. And there's so many of them that the Pharaoh then, we're getting into the book of Exodus now, which we haven't got to yet, but that the Pharaoh then is starting to worry about them because there are so many of them and they are so powerful. And he, cracks down on them and puts them under more servitude. And a lot of that's just because he's afraid of them. The founders of our country bent over backwards to make sure we didn't end up with a king and that the people had control. So I think that's in keeping with, more like the Christian worldview. But when we think about where we're going to end up in terms of our future as Christians, in terms of government, we look forward to the day, as the Bible tells us once again, throughout the Bible, looks forward to the day when God is going to step down and rule this earth. And then we're going to finally find ourselves in the perfect government, in the perfect kingdom. Now, if you'll remember, Christ, when he was talking to Pharaoh, made it clear that his government, his kingdom, was not of this world. And I think that's a picture that we can take with us. And we kind of have to picture ourselves as having like this dual citizenship, you might say. And the dual citizenship simply means that we are citizens of whatever country we might be living in, and as subjects of those kingdoms, we need to be law-abiding. We need to respect them and the benefit we receive from them. But ultimately, if you end up in a bad earthly kingdom, you can always look forward to the day when you, as a Christian, are going to live under the perfect rule of Jesus Christ. And certainly that is our ultimate model for a good kingdom. Well, I hope this has been a little different as we've talked about politics and how governments are run, but it's a great example here. And I think we have learned some lessons about God's sovereignty and how he controls things in government. So I hope it's been a blessing. And what we're going to look at next time is the way chapter 47 ends is Jacob is asking Joseph to make sure that when he dies, he ends up getting buried back in his homeland of Canaan. And that's kind of what we focus on, as he gives his blessings to his sons and then eventually finally dies. So I hope you'll be able to join us then. on Gen Z Bible class.